The last aspect that I would like to cover with respect to the history of mission this week are the core themes or missiological tensions that we see reoccurring over the centuries and around the world. The first core theme has to do with the paradox of incarnation or contextualization and universal application. Christianity as a faith incarnates into every culture that it enters. And in that process, it changes. And yet, it claims to be a universal faith. And that tension, that missiological tension between the incarnational contextualization process and the universal application plays out over and over again, like I said, through all the centuries and around the world. Here's a few aspects of that I'd like to highlight. The first one is that when Christianity enters into a culture and is written in that language, that can actually strengthen national identity. So it actually strengthens a particular national identity to have the scriptures written in that language. The example that Dr. Robert lifts up is Armenia, that Armenia consolidated as a nation state partly when the scriptures were put into Armenian. At the same time, of course, the process of translation involves international collaboration. So we see this paradox at work. I want to introduce you to the concept of hybridization in this process, that this is an aspect of the phenomena. Hybridization is what happens when you have two different cultures. It's actually a biological term that talks about two different species, but two different cultures that come together, and they don't just combine, they actually create something new. And that, of course, happens over and over again in terms of this tension between incarnation or contextualization and universal application, is that as Christianity enters a culture, in the relationship between one Christian culture and another Christian culture, we find the process of hybridization. And that's part of how we get closer to universal application, particularly within the last century and this century. The third aspect of this paradox that I'd like to lift up is the Gentile question. Of course, in the New Testament, it's called the Gentile question, which is the question about what is kept and what is left behind. So when we look at incarnation and contextualization, we're not just looking at it in terms of different cultures, we're looking at it in terms of different generations. So a new generation comes, and the question is, what has to be kept of the core of Christianity, of the universal of Christianity, and what is allowed to change? And so that's a perennial missiological tension. The second missiological tension that I'd like to name for you, because we will run into this over and over again as we study mission together, is the paradox of the alliances between the church and social power and the challenges from the margin. That vibrant Christianity always shifts power relationship. That, like we said earlier, it's inclusive, it lifts up the marginalized, and that means that it challenges the way that power is used and abused in our society. At the same time, Christianity also often ends up very close to centers of power, that Christians are in centers of power. And so we have Christian public leaders who can use that power to build shalom or to exploit under the cover of faith. And so that missiological tension comes up again and again. Technology. Technology can support mission or it can endanger mission. And lastly, the question of competing ideologies, that whether we're talking about Islam, whether we're talking about communism, whether we're talking about what the Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. calls plantation capitalism, these are all ideologies. And the question is, how does Christianity live in the midst of competing ideologies? I also, of course, want you to ask the connection question. I always want, as we're going through all of the modules on missiology, I really want you to continue to connect this with the world of development. So as we look at this last module around the ongoing themes and missiological tensions, I want you to ask yourself, how does and should all of this impact development? So these would be some of the questions you might want to consider. We are part of the mission of God and connected to the mission of the church. What does that imply as development professionals about our relationship with the local church? As we confront these missiological tensions, how do we hold on to the eternal in the midst of the contextual? And how does this affect the way that we relate to culture? How do we deal with power? Our power, the power of the poor, the power of the powerful? How do we maximize technology and keep it from controlling our work or contaminating our work? And how do we deal with competing ideologies? Thank you.